process for transforming layers begins to happen when you position different elements around your composition. Now, if we look at our training swoosh composition, go down to the timeline and click on the current time indicator. As I scrub through, I can see that I just have multiple layers that are set up that control the visibility of the different elements. And basically we start with a clean background, then we have this graphic build that happens, and then we have our last word, which is training. Now I want to add a couple more elements to this project, and as I do that, I'm going to go ahead and position those elements in the scene of my comp panel. Now positioning those elements is also known as transforming. So let's start by adding some background video. Since our background layer here is just a still element, we can open the video folder. And for video, I could either drag it directly down into my composition timeline, or I could drag it right out into my comp panel. Now, the way I typically like to work with video is just by double-clicking the video. That way, it opens up in a footage panel, and I can go ahead and just scrub through with my current time indicator down till I get to a point where I think I want to start using the video. Now, just so I can see the whole frame, I'm going to change my magnification to fit up to 100%. Now I'm going to scrub through and choose a start frame. I'll choose 5622 for my start. Now, if you click this left button in the bottom of your footage panel, that'll trim the end point of that layer. Now, I want 10 seconds of this footage because that's the length of my composition here. So if you go down to the time indicator in the lower left of the footage panel, go ahead and click on that and then press plus 10, 0, 0. So it's 10 seconds, 0 frames. So when I click OK, it's automatically going to move down 10 seconds. Now, if I want to trim the out point, I can trim it by clicking the second button here in the bottom of my footage panel. Now, to add to our composition, you want to click the Overlay Edit button, which is this button all the way on the right side of the footage panel in the lower area. So let's go ahead and click on that. And notice the footage was dropped right at the start of our current time indicator. So I'm going to slide this piece of footage to start at the beginning of our composition. And I'll do so by clicking on the green area and I'll start to drag. If I clicked on this lighter gray area, I get this that pops up. And what this is the slide tool. If I click here and start to drag, it'll allow me to choose the same length of the frames that I'm going to display, but I can slide exactly which frames appear in this area by clicking and dragging here. Now I'll just undo that last little change there and then just reposition the layer by clicking and dragging on the solid colored green area. Now if we press home on our keyboard, we can move our current time indicator to the beginning. And so we can see all the other graphic elements, let's click on layer 1 and drag it down just above our background layer. Since we don't need the background layer on anymore, I'll just turn its visibility off. Now that we have our layer added to our project, I'm going to go over my composition panel with my mouse and then scroll out with the scroll wheel. Notice I have these handles. These handles let me know that I can actually transform the position of this layer. So I can transform this in relation to the graphic elements that will be appearing. I'm going to move my current time indicator down the timeline to around 106. Basically, you just want to position it anywhere down the timeline so you can see these graphic elements. First thing, let's work on scale. Click on one of the corners and start to drag. Notice if I drag too much in one direction or the other, I'll distort my image. So I can hold down Shift as I drag to make it drag in proportion. Now I want this to still be slightly larger than the area that's going to render, so I'll make sure the handles are out here in this light gray area. This gray area will not render when you actually go to output this video. Now let's click and drag and slide this off to the left a little bit. And notice if I slide it off too far, then I'll lose the edge of my video. But I do want him kind of positioned off to the side here, so what I'll do is kind of split the difference. I'll position him like so, and then I'll grab another one of the corner handles and just hold down Shift as I drag. Now, as I'm dragging, if you look in the upper right corner of the interface, there's the info panel. Notice it has the name of the file that I have selected, and then it tells me the scale and value that the layer is going to be. So it's 86% of its original size. And then at the bottom, it's showing me how much I changed it. So I increased the size by 17%. Now that that's been positioned, I can scrub through and you can see I actually have video underneath of my project. Now, placing elements in 2D space is relatively straightforward. If you click on the handles, you can adjust the scale. If I click inside this bounding box, I can just reposition accordingly. And again, in the info panel, the info will update. Now, If I press W on my keyboard, that'll open my rotation tool. You should see it up here in the upper left corner of your tool panel. Now with that tool active, I can click on my layer and start to drag up or down, and it will rotate. So let me undo that. And let's add one more graphic element, and we'll position it over here in the corner. I'm going to press V on my keyboard to re-grab my selection tool so I don't accidentally rotate my layer. Open the graphics folder. In there, we'll see our H+ Sport Illustrator layer. So let's drag that down in the timeline to the top of the layer hierarchy. Now this is way too large. I can quickly jump to the scale parameter and change the scale here in the timeline by pressing S. Now if I just click and drag on the value for the scale, it'll go ahead and scale and stay in proportion as long as I leave this little chain checked. If that chain is unchecked, then I can distort my image, which I definitely don't want to do. So I'll just press Command Z twice to get back. Now I want to position this layer over here in the corner, so I'll do so. And as you're positioning text and graphics, you want to be familiar with this button in the lower left corner of the comp window. When you click on that, that's title and action safe. I want to make sure that my text stays inside of this second rectangle from the outside edge. So here's the first rectangle, there's the second. This is known as title safe. Any text you want to make sure stays inside that area. So I want to make this layer a little smaller. I'm going to click on one of the handles and hold down Shift. And here we go. In After Effects, you can have layers in 2D space or 3D space. Now, just so we can see this more clearly, I'm going to change my magnification back up to 100%, and I'll press the space bar so I can quickly grab my hand tool. Now, when I click and drag, I can move my canvas over so I could see my logo more clearly. Now, in order to see this better, I'll turn my title and action safe off by clicking on the button and then deselecting title and action safe. And if you notice, on this layer, I have this crosshair here. That's known as the anchor point. Anytime I make transformations like rotation, it will transform around that point. Now, when I change this layer into 3D, you'll see this point change. So to make our layer 3D, let's go down and look at the top layer in our timeline. If you don't see these switches set up here, you want to toggle your switches and modes till you can see this. This box right here lets me know that this column controls whether or not the layer is 3D. So when I click on it, I've now made it a 3D layer, and I have these handles, Y, X, and Z. So if I click on X, it'll only move on the X axis. Let me undo that. Now, if I press W to grab my rotation tool, check this out. If I hover over top of the Y axis, and I just click and drag left or right, now it's going to rotate around in 3D space. Now let's say for whatever reason I wanted to move my anchor point so that I could rotate around the bottom word as opposed to the way it's set up right now in the middle. Just undo that. You can grab this tool up here called the Pan Behind tool. With that tool, you can click on any anchor point and then reposition it in your timeline. Now, usually when I'm working in 3D, I would encourage you to click directly on the axis handle for whatever it is you're attempting to move. That way you don't accidentally move it in Z space. If you look in the info panel on the right, you can see my Z value is set to 0. Next to position, it gives me my X value, then my Y, and then my 0. So let's position this down towards the bottom of the layer. And now if I press W to grab my rotation tool, I can click on the X axis, and now as I start to rotate, it'll only rotate around that X point. Now just so we can see the rest of the graphic, let's go ahead and change our magnification setting in the lower left corner of the composition panel. Click on it and choose Fit up to 100%. Now we can collapse layer 1 since we don't need to see any of the parameters in the timeline, and we can go ahead and close our video folder, graphics folder, and our output comps folder in our project panel. I'm just going to click in this gray area to clear out anything in the top of the panel. Then I'm just going to click down in the timeline panel to make sure the timeline's active and deselect layer 1. I'm just clicking in this general area here because I know it won't allow me to select anything when I click there. So when it comes to transforming layers inside of After Effects, you can transform them in 2D space or you can transform them in 3D space. The biggest thing that I recommend is just to make sure that you pay attention to what's happening by looking over in the info panel.
Yeah.